what is the discounted cash flow and what is the present value of this patient. And it would not just be India that's a loser, it would be the whole world. Opioids are very useful, especially in acute pain management. So if you are into fitness, if you are into, really kind of bulking up or whatever, I would venture that hemp seed and hemp seed powder would probably be.
Welcome to Diary of a Publisher. Today, we dive into a very complex and a critical subject with our guest, Raghav Priyadarshi. We are delving into the world of hemp, CBD, and pharmaceutical industry, topics that intersect health, ethics, and traditions. Raghav is a co-founder of Savikalpa Sciences, a company pioneering in CBD-based medicine, which is rooted in ancient Ayurvedic principles. He brings with him a wealth of experience and insights on the subject of CBD and its healing properties, while navigating challenges and opportunities within the pharmaceutical industry. Together, let's explore the therapeutic benefits of CBD, the ethical dilemma of the pharmaceutical industry, and the ancient healing wisdom such as the Ayurveda. Join us for a thought-provoking conversation that sheds light on the benefits of CBD, on the complexities of modern medicine, and the timeless wisdom that continues to shape our understanding of health and wellness. Presenting to you, Raghav Priyadarshi. I would like to start our conversation on the theme of today, which is your company, Savikalpa. Do you want to tell me a little more about it? About Savikalpa, what you do, and your vision?
So in brief terms, Savikalpa Sciences was started in 2020, just before the pandemic. It is now therefore a 4-year-old effort. And in short, what we are attempting to do with Savikalpa is to position Indian life sciences, the Indian pharmaceutical industry, to graduate from a generic medicine manufacturer, and we do that brilliantly, but to move up the value chain and actually create investigational new drugs, to create formulations, what we call phytoformulations, which are researched, have gone through the entire suite of in vitro lab studies, in vivo animal studies, and human clinical trials as well, in order to establish the primacy of natural compound medicines. We really believe in the power of nature, and we really find that nature provides you inspiration for all manner of things, but also in particular to heal. We have an understanding of the natural healing compounds or herbs, plants, minerals for millennia in countries like India and China and Egypt and Mesopotamia. Even if you look back at ancient cultures, and perhaps most prevalent today, at least in terms of continuity, remains to be, at least in India and China, traditional Chinese medicine, and very importantly, Ayurveda, for example, in India, right? We've had an understanding of what the healing powers of naturally occurring substances or compounds are, and that is recorded in the canons of an Ayurveda, Unani, Siddha traditional medicine texts. We find that there is a whole body of knowledge that we can only scratch the surface of, and we take inspiration from that, but deploy modern clinical pharmacological tools and research and investigation tools to create novel medicines inspired from the past, but updated to the needs and, let's say, conveniences of the 21st century. In a nutshell, this is what we're attempting to do with Savikalpa Sciences.
So the natural element that you are talking about, for you is the main element is CBD.
So I would like to add to that what we're focusing on are the compounds found in the cannabis plant, which are called cannabinoids. So there are today, scientists have isolated and identified about 160 unique compounds found almost exclusively in the cannabis plant, called cannabinoids, of which one compound is CBD. So CBD is perhaps the most well-known of the cannabis compounds in the world, and there are various reasons why the CBD industry has mushroomed over the past 5-10 years globally. But from a scientific lens and from a therapeutic lens, CBD, THC, which is another compound which might be well known, it is the compound that gives you a high, for example, when you consume cannabis recreationally, whether you're smoking or whether you're consuming, for example, bhang or an edible. It is THC, which is the compound which has got very significant therapeutic properties, but it is also intoxicating. So you always have a dual use or purpose when it comes to any substance, and that's an understanding in Ayurveda. Even a poison can be medicine, and even a medicine can be poison. It depends on how you prepare and how you use. But yes, our focus is on CBD, our focus is on THC, but it is also on understanding what some of the other less well known compounds found in the cannabis plant are and what their therapeutic applications are. Some of these compounds are CBG, CBN, CBGA, CBDA. Like I said, there are, both acidic, sort of families and individual compounds, most of which are not fully explored. And we're only just beginning to understand what the therapeutic applications of these can be. So, yes, CBD and more.
So Savikalpa's main products at the moment are what?
What we found in research, and this is not just primary research that Savikalpa Sciences has done, and I'm very proud to say that Savikal has been pushing the frontier of R&D from a pharmacological lens in India because we have the talent to do so. But where we are finding, both from secondary references globally over the past 30, 40 years, there has been increased understanding at an academic level, at an institutional level, and I guess over the past 10 years in particular in many countries around the world like Canada, US, I don't know, Argentina, recently, Canada, and maybe 20 odd other countries which have got a medical cannabis regime. So we have some understanding of what the potential medical applications of cannabis are, but we find that we need to go beyond what is the medical cannabis industry's understanding today, in the sense that 90% of patients accessing cannabis globally for any therapeutic benefit are largely purchasing flower or bud or a concentrate. Now, these are form factors which you are smoking, which you are inhaling through vaporization, perhaps, or whatever the case is. But in our view, these are not clinical form factors. These are not form factors of consuming a medicine or any medical compound which can be administered in a clinical setting. This is not something that can be administered in a hospital or a clinic, or for that matter, by somebody who doesn't smoke or somebody who has never consumed cannabis naive people, right? So in some countries where there is greater awareness and acceptance maybe of medical cannabis, it does work. But we feel that medical cannabis is very much on the spectrum of somewhere in between medicine, recreation, and wellness. We feel that the therapeutic applications of cannabis compounds really merit a very thorough investigation. And what we're finding is that there are, to answer your question, three broad areas where we're finding very significant, very encouraging results. The first of these is pain management. Now, what we're finding is that when it comes to pain, it's a very complex category or very complex issue. There are many different kinds of pains. And I would say that we can easily say that, there are at a divided level, maybe 20 different types of pains, but at a broad level, there are three types of pains. One is what is nociceptive pain, one is a neuropathic pain, and a third, more modern categorization is a neuroplastic pain. To go away from the jargon, broadly, you can say that there is acute pain. If you've been injured, if you've had some kind of an impact, injury, accident, whatever, which leads to some amount of tissue damage, and that leads to an acute pain at the site, for example, of impact. Musculoskeletal, effectively, right? Neuropathic pains are those which, obviously, as the name suggests, are because of some level of action or discomfort at your neurological level, right? So neuropathic pains can be when there is a nerve impingement, when your nerve gets pressed. For example, sciatica is perhaps one of the most common, commonly known and commonly suffered types of neuropathic pain. But you also have, for example, migraine. Migraine is again an underlying neurological condition which expresses as pain. Important to remember that pain is a symptom. Pain is not a disease, but a symptom of something which is leading to your feeling discomfort, which is to your feeling pain. And the third type of pain is what doctors today are calling nociplastic. These could be pains, again, some doctors also categorize sciatica sometimes because, patients oftentimes come to doctors, to, orthopedics or to rheumatological doctors or whatever the case may be, neuropaths, and they are presenting pain, but in terms of their tests, in terms of their physical investigation, physiologically, there's nothing wrong with them. The patient is still in pain, but you're not able to identify what the cause of the pain is. Another thing which has unfortunately become quite common, especially post-COVID, is fibromyalgia. You might be hearing of people who are suffering from fibromyalgia. Now, fibromyalgia is a catch-all phrase, which is non-specific pain that you feel throughout the body, what technically they call global pain, but for which you can't identify the reason. So nociplastic pains are pains which are indeterminate in nature.
What's the root cause for that?
But we don't know what the cause for nociplastic pains is. That is why they've created a third category in a sense. Unknown origin. Pain is there, but unknown origin.
So are you trying to say that the products that Savikalpa offers has the capacity to...
So what we're finding is that not in acute pain, but in chronic neuropathic pain and in nociplastic pain, cannabinoid medicine, CBD, THC and various other compounds, and not just cannabis compounds. We are finding that there are other synergistic herbs and compounds that you can combine together to enhance the activity of what is called synergistic action. But in particular, neuropathic pain, and under neuropathic pain, we also include cancer-related pain, especially late-stage terminal cancer patients oftentimes feel very acute pain throughout the body. So we're finding that cannabis compounds and cannabis medicines, oral medicines, for example, are very beneficial in treating some of these neuropathic pains and some of the nociplastic or non-specific pain. This is one category of usage of cannabis medicines. The other, as I already mentioned, is neurological conditions. So going beyond pain, but neurological conditions in particular, I think there is greatest understanding today of the very, very significant therapeutic application in treating, for example, epilepsy, seizure disorders, and there are various types of seizure disorders. And again, there are different compounds in the cannabis plant which might be beneficial in treating, for example, these kinds of conditions. Other neurological conditions, again, where we're finding very, very promising results. I already mentioned migraine. I think cannabis is really, if you would ask me one condition in which cannabis medicines are proving to be extremely effective, I would say that migraine is by far, at least in our experience thus far over the past 4 years, one condition where we're getting tremendous results. And just for reference, patients who suffer, let us say, 2 migraine attacks a week, after they have started consuming cannabinoid medicines, have reported a 90-95% reduction in the frequency of attacks. So patients who might have, let's say, had an attack or two a week, a migraine attack or two a week, in 6 months are reporting maybe 2 attacks. And that is transformational in terms of their quality of life. One way to look at cannabis medicines is also that they are quality of life enhancing medicines. They are not treating any one particular condition, but they're improving the overall response of the body to both heal itself and to improve the action of other medicines. So almost as an adjunct to other medicines. And the third category that I would like to point out is mental health applications. Now, this is something that at Savikalpa Sciences we have not explored as much as perhaps maybe some other efforts around the world have, but we do know, for example, that CBD, you mentioned this compound in the beginning, has anxiolytic properties. So it is very good for general anxiety disorder, anxiety management. Similarly, I mentioned that THC induces euphoria. THC is what gets you high. But if you look at it from a mental health application lens, you have persons who might be suffering from chronic depression. Those persons, if administered THC, it improves and lifts their mood. And therefore, they come back into feeling normal, feeling, less depressive. If you are sober and you consume the same compound, you get high. But if you are low and consume that compound, you come back to homeostasis, you come back to balance. In Hindi, you say santulan, right? So always depends on what the use case is. If a person uses some product, it might lead to a result which we call getting intoxicated, getting high. But if somebody who's suffering, let's say from chronic depression and who is, longitudinally depressive or low, for that person, that same thing enables them to feel better. So mental health, pain management, certain kinds of pain management, and neurological, some applications in the neurological universe are where we're finding, at least thus far, for there to be very significant, let's say, applications. Just one more thing that I would like to add. We've started work, and there are again efforts around the world that have really, shown some very, very impressive results in vitro at a lab level. But there seem to be very significant applications of cannabinoid medicine in oncology, in cancer management. Now, we know for a fact that for palliative care, which is to reduce, let's say, the suffering, improve the quality of life of terminally ill cancer patients, whether it is to manage the side effects, for example, of chemotherapy. We know that Cannabinoid medicine is very effective in managing nausea and vomiting, which is one of the most common side effects of patients undergoing, for example, chemotherapy. But at a lab level, we're finding that cannabinoids are also showing anti-tumor properties. The challenge currently for the scientific community, both not just at Savikalpa, but for the global scientific community, is to really be able to identify what the mechanism of action of that anti-tumor activity is, and to be able to ensure that you can repeat those results. Repeatability is the hallmark of medicine. You can have one person benefiting, you can have 5 people benefiting, but can you consistently ensure that patients who access a particular medicine get the same benefit?
Right.
That really is what the effort is for us at Savikalpa Sciences.
Wow, that's brilliant. But I would like to understand more on a basic level in terms of the plant. The entire plant, you would call that cannabis, right? That
Yes,
plant is
absolutely.
called cannabis.
Yes.
What are the different parts of the plant and what are the different uses as well?
The scientific name is cannabis. It might be identified as Cannabis sativa or Cannabis indica. These are just classifications
Types
of
of
the
plants,
plant, types of plant. There is, from a chemical or a phytochemical point of view, no difference between a sativa and an indica. They're identical. Cannabis is one plant species, right? Most of what today we call sativa, indica, if I may add, is really coming from the recreational industry, in which you're suggesting that, oh, this is a sativa, this is an indica. From a drug, from a pharmacological, from a scientific lens, none of this really makes any sense, right? But what are the different applications? So the cannabis plant is quite unique in the sense that it has very significant applications. And for us at Savikalpa, we are only focusing on the therapeutic medical applications. But any plant, and the cannabis plant has the root, it has the stem, it has stalks, it has leaves, it has seeds, and it has the flower, right? And the flower has the seeds, for example, right? Depending on what the physiology of the plant is. Now, what we find is that these compounds called cannabinoids are found throughout the plant, but the concentration of these varies depending on which part of the plant we're talking about. So the highest concentration of these potentially therapeutic compounds is found in the flower or the bud of the plant. But that is not to say that it's also found in the leaf. The concentration of these compounds in the leaf is a fraction of what the concentration of the compounds in, for example, the flower is. From a drug manufacturing lens, there is not too much difference outside of the fact that for you to extract what we call the active pharmaceutical ingredient or the active compounds from the cannabis plant, when we want to do further, formulation development, you would need a certain amount of biomass to, let's say, extract 1 kilo active cannabis compounds from the flower of the cannabis plant. You might need 10 or 100 times that biomass if you were extracting, let's say, 1 kilo from the leaf of the cannabis plant. So just the amount of raw material that you need at the initial stage of extraction would be much more if you were, let's say, extracting cannabinoids from the leaf of the plant. It would be much smaller quantity of, let's say, much smaller mass of the flower that you would need to get the same amount of cannabis compounds from the extraction process. But these are the two places where we find the therapeutic compounds in significant concentration for us to be able to extract and therefore to do medical pharmacological development. But one of the most common uses outside of medical usage, and medical usage has been recorded thousands of years back, right, even in traditional texts, but one of the most common and I would say prevalent uses up until maybe even just 100 years back was for fiber. So the stalk of the cannabis plant has been used in traditional societies, and in fact not even traditional societies, like I would say modern industrial societies. Hemp, which is also in English the same as cannabis, hemp equals cannabis in English, at least from a dictionary definitional sense. Hemp farming was very, very prevalent, and I think one of the facts that is very well known is that hemp was as well traded as jute, for example, up until the advent of the modern cotton industry effectively. And hemp was perhaps the most common textile, most common fiber in up till the 19th century. And you have even the founding fathers of America, for example, majority of whom had hemp cultivation, hemp farms, right? But even in traditional societies, important to note that cannabis is endemic, for example, to South Asia. Cannabis grows automatically in this part of the world. It is largely assumed that from South Asia, which could be Afghanistan, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, wherever, right? But effectively from South Asia, probably this plant was then taken through trade over the millennia around the world, and then it propagated in other parts of the world as well. But here, where it grows automatically, post the monsoons from August up until about October or November, from Jammu and Kashmir all the way to Arunachal, all the way down to the Deccan, it's a weed.
Yeah.
It's not a plant that requires any fertilizer, any pesticides, any imports. It's not a water intense plant either, right? Local cultures found that by processing the stalk of this plant, they could extrude fibers, and they could use those fibers to make sacks, to make sheets, to make clothes, to make ropes. It's a very high tensile strength fiber, and therefore it was even used, for example, to tie animals, or to in construction, for example, to make slippers. Across the board, it was the most prevalent textile. And because of the fact that it is literally a weed, the costs of production of this agri commodity to make then fiber, to make textiles out of it, is even lower than that of cotton. So sometimes it bears, some thought or investigation as to why is it that we are not wearing, I'm sorry, I could have worn a cannabis, based shirt or whatever it is, but why is it that cotton is the most prevalent textile today, natural textile today, as opposed to cannabis or as opposed to hemp fiber? Because hemp is even cheaper to produce, and it has got all, and in fact better properties than cotton, which is the most common textile in fashion, in retail, in clothing today, right? There are potentially many reasons for that. It could be that it is because of corporate interests, it is because of lobbying interests, that there might have been the new cotton barons maybe in the 1910s, 20s and 30s who actively lobbied their governments to reduce the primacy of hemp fiber so that they could then propagate cotton as the new textile growth engine of the future, or whatever the case may be. And potentially also, I think from the medical side, it is important to remember that it is hard to create IP, to have patents on naturally occurring compounds. So even the life sciences, even the pharmaceutical industry would find it very hard to patent any drugs that they made which are derived from naturally occurring substances like the cannabis plant. And sure, we're talking about the cannabis plant, we can talk about areca, we could talk about rosemary, we could talk about ashwagandha, it doesn't matter, right? But you cannot claim a patent on something that nature produces. It's not something that you have done, right? So it becomes harder for you to justify that you own IP, and therefore for you to charge oversized profits from your medical industry, right? But so whatever the reasons are, but for up until about 100 years back, cannabis was very prevalent in medicine and also in fiber and textiles, but it kind of fell off the map for various reasons that we probably can't go into right now. But people can probably investigate, and lots of literature that exists online, kind of deliberating, discussing the same. So textiles, medicine, also as a food actually, but in a limited sense. Right. We find, for example, I have a small property in Uttarakhand, and in villages in that region of Kumaon, this is the Kumaon region of Uttarakhand, oftentimes you find, especially in the winters, so the local communities, they harvest the cannabis plant, they actually cultivate hemp and cannabis plant, and they harvest the plant for again usage to make textiles. Especially in remote villages, even today you see that there is still fiber that they derive from the plants. Those which are sort of more connected now to the modern world and who have road connectivity, etc., maybe this practice has died out. But they also take the seeds of the cannabis plant, and one of the most common things in the winters for breakfast in these villages is that they have bhang ki chutney. So they make chutney with the hemp seeds. It's very nutty. They mix it with a few other things, including, I'm guessing, dhania, this, that. I'm not a cook, so I really won't be able to tell what the recipe is. But bhang ki chutney, I oftentimes find in the villages in the winters, is consumed at breakfast. And we speak to the women do all the work, frankly, right? Like, I mean, I don't know what the men are doing, but the women are taking care of the kids, they're taking care of the cattle, they're taking care of, education, and they're also going out to the fields and they're farming. It seems that all of the economic and social activity by at least the women that I've seen in the Uttarakhand Himalaya are managed by the women. I'm really not sure what the men are doing all day, right? But that apart, I remember speaking to one of them and they're like, garmahat pahunchati hai. So I'm like, why do you eat this bhang seed, cannabis seed, hemp seed chutney? And they said, literally, it is because it generates heat. So we consume it with breakfast in the morning. It doesn't get you high. It's not intoxicating. The concentration of THC or other compounds found in the seed is so minor that it is below any psychotropic level, for example, right? It will not create any psychogenic action. But they consume it literally because in local parlance, they say it generates heat. And in the winters, when they go to work in the fields, it kind of energizes them effectively, right? From again a modern nutritional lens, what we know today is that the cannabis seed contains 12 essential amino acids.
Wow.
It is the only naturally occurring seed in the world that contains 12 essential amino acids. So you can say it's a super duper food. It's not just a super food like a chia or like whatever else it might be current today, right? It's literally like a super duper food. Now, personally, I'm not the biggest fan of cannabis seeds in terms of flavor. I find them a little bitter. But from a health point of view, if you were to consume, for example, hemp seed powder as a protein, as a plant protein supplement, it would be way more nutritive than a pea protein, or for that matter, any sort of other standard proteins that are usually derived from, let's say, milk products or otherwise that we consume, right? So if you are into fitness, if you are into, really kind of bulking up or whatever, I would venture that hemp seed and hemp seed powder would probably be way more nutritive and beneficial in bulking up, if perhaps that's what you are inclined to do.
Wow.
So in a nutshell, there are many different traditional applications. Going beyond traditional applications today, because of the addition of technology engineering, we can actually come up with modern sort of use cases of the fiber in particular. So there are already, over the past 10-15 years, uses of cannabis fiber in 100 different applications beyond just clothing, beyond just fiber, beyond just textiles. For example, hempcrete. So cannabis hemp fibers are being, hemp herds as they call them, are being used to reinforce and sort of into mud and make a building material which is again as strong as regular concrete blocks for that matter, right? So again, it has got many properties which are good for the environment. It is not very intensive in terms of power and water to make, but obviously there are still challenges around scaling up some of these applications.
Right.
Similarly, you could have some composite compounds. So like I've seen, for example, you could have a briefcase, like a hard briefcase, which instead of being made from, well, maybe traditionally leather, but in a more modern context from some petrochemical derivative, is usually what, most hard plastics today are effectively. You could have the replacement of hard plastics entirely by fiber, by compounds, which are derived from the hemp plant effectively. So again, this is not an area of expertise for us at Savikalpa Sciences. We're focusing on the medicine, but there are a huge number of applications of the cannabis plant. It's a very economic crop, and therefore governments, especially in countries like India, should really explore how they can enable the development of cultivation of the cannabis plant for various industrial uses, for medicinal uses, but for also industrial and potentially even food, but largely industrial uses. It's got tremendous opportunity to add to farm income. It has the values of not requiring very expensive inputs to cultivate. You can have at least 2 growing cycles in a year. So if there was demand aggregation at the level of industry in terms of what the applications and use cases of, let's say, this fiber are, it would lead to a very significant benefit at the level of the farmer. We speak about doubling farmers' incomes. Honestly, 22 has come and gone. We are yet to, we've forgotten about the fact that we were supposed to double our farmers' incomes as per, let's say, the objectives of the country and government 2017, 2018. But there are many small things, such as, for example, fibers, which can really benefit the wide swathe of our rural economy as well. So really not something that Savikalpa Sciences is focusing on, but there are tremendous applications. And I'm glad that there are, I'm sure, efforts around the country and around the world which are looking to enhance the use case.
Even after so many uses this plant holds, why does cannabis get such a bad PR?
I think that it is again entrenched in what happened when it came to suppressing cannabis maybe 100 years back, right? And really, this is a narrative from the West. If we look at the fact that, largely probably the cotton industry and the cotton barons of the early 20th century wanted to ensure that their product or produce took primacy, there was probably a concerted campaign to badmouth cannabis, right? And yes, cannabis has been used recreationally. Cannabis does cause intoxication, but so do many other things. And it's not like we don't consume them. For example, alcohol, right? I mean, alcohol and cannabis are 2 compounds that have probably been consumed forever and ever in traditional societies, in proto-societies, and in modern societies as well. So I think that the stigma around cannabis really stems from a concerted campaign to, sort of demerit cannabis, and through a PR campaign or a lobbying campaign, perhaps 100 odd years back, largely in the United States, where sort of these corporate commercial interests suggested that cannabis was a plant that led to intoxication, that led to degeneration of the individual's thought, thinking, mind, because it was a intoxicating drug. And yes, it is an intoxicating drug, but for thousands of years we knew that it is much more than an intoxicating drug as well. I would like to point here, again, coming back to Ayurveda, Ayurveda recognizes cannabis, classifies cannabis as a upavisha. And upavisha is a minor poison. So Ayurveda says that this is poison. Therefore, if you consume in its raw form, it will lead to intoxication and potentially some negative, other negative side effects. But there is a process prescribed in Ayurveda which is called Shuddhikaran, which is like purification. So you purify this minor poison and you remove its negative properties. And then what you are left with, what in Ayurveda and Sanskrit is called Vijaya, which is basically cannabis, whole cannabis extract. That is medicinal. So what was poison through a purification then becomes medicine. So, it isn't that this was unknown in 1930s America, right? I mean, cannabis was very, very prevalent. In a pharmacy, if you went, you would find that there were all kinds of tinctures, for example, which had cannabis and was very commonly used and prescribed. So there are commercial and corporate interests that try to obviously degrade the, general public understanding of what the applications of cannabis are for commercial, for lobbying interests, for corporate interests, for commercial interests. And that, I think, persists till date. They were very successful. And so at the level of the average individual, when you mention the word cannabis, you think of, in India, maybe Babaji is smoking a chillam or something at the Kumbh Mela, or, you just assume that this is a substance used by and abused by youngsters and rock and roll artists or whatever, right? And it is not something which has any application in regular social use. This is very far from the truth. And therefore, one of the big challenges for not just us, but people who are associated with medicine or with natural compound medicine or with cannabis in particular around the world is to continue to work to dissolve the stigma that persists till date.
Okay, so we spoke about the cultural benefits. We spoke about historical nuances. Would you want to talk about the legal implications right now in India?
Sure. And I can only really speak of in India. It is actually very encouraging that India actually, I always say, has the oldest medical cannabis regime in the world. Canada might say that, we are pioneers in medical cannabis, or California might say we're pioneers in medical cannabis, this, that, and the other. But boss, Ayurveda has existed here for 2,500 years. There are at least 200 formulations in the classical texts of Ayurveda that contain references to cannabis being one of the principal compounds used in that formulation. So, in a sense, because Ayurveda, there is still an Ayush regulatory regime in the country. You have the CDSCO, the Central Drug Standards Control Organization, that approves all the allopathic drugs. But you have the Department of Ayush, which is Ayurveda and Unani and Siddha and Tibetan medicine and homeopathy, which is alternative or non-allopathic medicine systems, which are regulated by the Ayush department, right? So because Ayurveda was prevalent 2,500 or 5,000 years back and it is prevalent today, I make the argument that India has the oldest medical cannabis regime, and it's always been there. We've not had to create a new access to medical cannabis regime, which is the case in the US, which is the case in Canada, for example, right? In India, we've always had cannabis used as a medicinal compound under Ayurveda, and which is why medicines made from the cannabis plant are entirely legal. They are regulated by the Ayush department currently. And as long you have to get approvals as a medicine manufacturer, as a drug research firm, as a marketing firm, you have to get approvals from the relevant authorities. But currently, the regulations in India governing cannabis are more enabling than they are in Switzerland or that they are in the US because of Ayurveda.
That's encouraging.
That's very encouraging. That means that we have the potential, and in fact, we are already doing a lot more than, for example, some very large multi-billion-dollar companies are able to do from a drug investigation and a drug development lens in India, as opposed to what you may be able to do, because cannabis is still federally, for example, restricted in the US. You can't get grants from from the government. You can't work with institutes of national importance and eminence. You can't work with the National Institutes of Health or medicine for you to conduct pharmacological scientific research on cannabis. You can sell medical cannabis, but it is still not something that you can sell at a CVS or at a Boots, at a pharmacy. In the US, you have to go to an alternative access point, which is a cannabis clinic, and you get a card. And so, it's an alternative access. You're not just going to your regular chemist, your regular pharmacy, right? In India, cannabis is considered a therapeutic agent, and therefore, as long as you are subscribing to the drug standards, which are more complex than cannabis standards. Cannabis standards are largely non-existent in the world, right? So you and I could be selling medical cannabis, and there are very few sort of parameters that we need to adhere to. They're lower than making chips, for example, right? Like food substances have higher regulatory standards, whether it is the FDA or in India, the FSSAI, than currently the medical cannabis industry does. But the drug industry has very substantial standards. So as long as you are subscribing to what the regulations of the drug industry are, in India today, you can manufacture and market and consume medicines that contain cannabis compounds. But on a lighter note, I would like to actually point to the fact that there is a lot of confusion also when it comes to the Indian rules, regulations, and laws governing cannabis. We are perhaps all familiar with the NDPS Act. The NDPS Act is the Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substances Act, which was enacted in 1985. This is the central legislation that governs all the different substances which are considered to be narcotic and therefore which are restricted. Cannabis is still part of the NDPS Act. Now, if it is a restricted compound, you may question how is it that you can make medicines from it, right? Important to point out that, for example, even opium is a narcotic compound. Yet you make opiate medicines, you make opioid drugs. These are drugs which are used for intervention pain management around the world. We should know as Indians that India produces approximately 50% of the licit opium used by the pharmaceutical industry globally. But it is a narcotic compound and cultivation is restricted. Cultivation is technically banned / restricted in the sense that the Indian government has come out with a regulation, a regulatory, ecosystem which enables bonded sort of, cultivation of opium, of poppy plants, from which then the opioid, alkaloid compounds are extracted, derived, and then sold to the pharmaceutical industry. That pharmaceutical industry then makes all the drugs, whether it is a morphine, whether it is a tramadol, whether it is a Ultracet, whatever it is, or for that matter, I don't know, you might be familiar with the opioid crisis in the US, right? Oxycontin is very, very, today I suppose well known. Purdue Pharma, which is, rightly so a maligned pharmaceutical organization. The base compound that they use to make all these drugs comes, 50% at least of that base compound comes from India. So India supplies the base compound for the global opioid and pain management industry. There is no reason why India can't also supply cannabinoids, which are more effective than opioids in treating various different conditions. Opioids are very useful as well. I don't want to malign opioids. They have a very specific use case. The problem with the global medical industry is overprescription of opioids and prescribing opioids when they are not warranted. They can be very harmful. They can lead to fatality, which is an absolute adverse outcome. There can be a relative adverse outcome that, I felt uneasy, I felt nausea, I felt a little, I don't know, I had tachycardia, whatever, I had some, increase in heartbeat. But fatality is an absolute adverse outcome. And unfortunately, opioids are very useful, especially in acute pain management. Let us say you have an accident, unfortunately, your limb gets chopped off. You should be administered an opioid medicine so as to be able to manage the pain and for there to be some kind of a medical surgical intervention procedure. But they are not really the best medicines to be given for, let's say if you have shingles, if you have some rashes and you have some pain because of those, which might be neurological in nature, cannabinoids will work much better. And you are absolutely certain that they will not lead to death, even if somebody overdoses on the recommended medicine, for example, right? But coming back to the law, 1985, we enacted the NDPS Act. This was a copy essentially of what is the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs. So at the UN, India is a founding member of the United Nations. We were signatory to this convention on controlling narcotic drugs, which we signed, I think, in 1961, 1962. All member countries who sign international obligations, resolutions who agree upon at the UN have to ratify that in their national legislation within a period of 25 years. So I think sometime in the early to mid 80s, the mandarins, babus in Delhi probably were like, oh wait, we signed this global agreement. Now we have to ensure that time is up. We have to ensure that our national laws are in consonance with what our global sort of obligations agreed upon are, right, at international fora. So essentially, we more or less copy pasted the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs, which became what is today the NDPS Act. But I think we have to give credit to our bureaucrats, our mandarins, our government of the day then, because they understood that while the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs of the UN banned cannabis, in India, especially in rural India, which maybe in the mid 1980s comprised 70-75% of the population which was living in rural India, and even today I think it's about 65% of the population which is in rural India, their primary caregiver was probably a Hakim, was probably a Vaid, was probably a traditional medicine practitioner. And traditional medicine practitioners used cannabis very extensively in the formulations that they used. So I think that the government of the day understood that if they banned cannabis in toto, it would lead to a very significant impact on the primary care ecosystem in the country, which was accessing traditional medicine, traditional healthcare practitioners. So a caveat was created which exists till this day. In India, cultivation of cannabis is banned. I'll come to that later, but currently cultivation of cannabis is banned under NDPS. Furthermore, the flower, which has the highest concentration, like I mentioned earlier, of cannabinoids, these compounds of the cannabis plant, the flower is banned. But the leaf is legal, the seed is legal, the stem is legal, the stalk is legal, the root is legal. Now, it's like saying that, okay, langda is banned. You can have a langde ka ped, but the langda fruit, you can't eat, okay? Now, I don't know how you get the fruit without the seed, without the plant. I mean, how can you ban one part of a plant and, have another part of the plant which is legal? But this is the legalese distinction, and it's actually quite intelligent. The government or the mandarins understood that the leaf of the plant also contains these therapeutic compounds, maybe in less quantity, but they also contain. So they said the leaf is legal, the flower is illegal. And we've banned cultivation. So we remain in compliance with our international obligation because we enacted the NDPS Act, we banned cultivation of cannabis, but we said that the leaf is not illegal. Now, when we access raw material to make medicines, the only licit way for us to do so is to get it from government. So we apply to government for a quota, we get a certain amount of raw material given to us by government. You cannot buy raw cannabis in the open market. What we get from government is leaf. It is the leaf of the cannabis plant. And collection is allowed. Cultivation is not allowed, but collection of cannabis raw material is allowed under the NDPS Act. So, because it is endemic to the country, because it propagates automatically, you don't even really need to cultivate cannabis because it grows on every roadside, gully, farm, wherever in the jungle, on the hillside, everywhere, right? So this is a sort of a legal distinction in which, in a modern legalese, definitional sense, today we call the cannabis leaf in Indian laws as bhang. And bhang is legal. We call the flower ganja. Ganja is illegal. And the resin which is extracted from the ganja or the flower, which we call hash or hashish, the word actually comes from hashish, is also illegal. So the flower is illegal, the leaf is legal. We can therefore make medicine from the leaf. And for us, we don't really care because we're doing modern pharmacology. So, as long as we can access the compounds, the therapeutic compound from the leaf, it would be better if we had access to the flower.
So you're saying you source your plants from the government?
From the government. The only legal way for you as a drug manufacturing company, as a traditional, we're registered as an Ayush drug manufacturing company, is for us to.
And who's cultivating for the government?
So, the government says that they actually give licenses for collection of cannabis raw material. So there is no cultivation, like in the case of, for example, poppy cultivation. We know that there are 8 or 9 districts in Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, and Uttar Pradesh where there is actual bonded cultivation, which is denotified that this is the area where there is poppy cultivation.
And they only sell to the government.
And government buys all of the produce.
Yeah.
Sure, there might be some amount of diversion. Diversion is a fact of life. There might be some amount of diversion that goes into the illicit market for you to then probably from that same compound that is given to you when you have, let's say, a meningitis attack and you have an intravenous tramadol injection so as to reduce the pain, but that same base compound is also used to make heroin for that matter, right? So if it goes into the black market, it would be a drug. But when it goes into the pharmaceutical industry, it's also a drug. It's a drug for therapeutic benefit, or the other is for recreational abuse, effectively, right? So in cannabis, in the case of cannabis, as per our understanding, what the government says is that they give collection licenses, collection thekas for farmers, or I don't know for who, to go and collect the wild biomass, which then the government buys and sells onwards to, for example, drug companies such as ourselves.
Fair.
Whether this happens in practice or not, I have absolutely no idea. But this is at least what my understanding of the procurement of the raw material by government is.
One question I really am intrigued to ask you is that, cannabis as a plant is used for medicinal purposes, it's used for recreational purposes, but it's also used for spiritual purposes. Do you have any knowledge about that?
Only, a very nominal understanding, I would say, in the sense that, yes, cannabis has been used and we are familiar with the association of cannabis, one with Shiva, with Shivji as somebody, and there are various, I suppose, references in probably texts like the Shiv Puran where, there is reference of how, Shiva consumes cannabis for various reasons. I mean, it is not for recreation as per my understanding. It is for some purpose. Usually the purpose is, I think one of the things that I'm familiar with is the fact that, Shivji, as we call Neelkant also, because he consumed poison and then retained poison, which was also the byproduct of the churning of the oceans, right? So if you remember that there is the old story, the myth in which the Devas and the Asuras, they come together and they recognize that if they do the Samudra Manthan, they come together to churn the oceans. Is it the earth oceans or the cosmic oceans? I don't know. But one of the mythological stories is in which the Devas and the Asuras come together. They do what we call the Samudra Manthan, which is the churning of the ocean, because that will produce Amrit, nectar, right? Ambrosia. But we often forget that along with the ambrosia is produced poison. So Vishnu ji, one of the triumvirate of our Vishnu, Shiva and Brahma trinity, Vishnu is assisting both the Devas and the Asuras in the churning of the oceans so as to produce the Amrit. But Shiva comes in to actually say that, okay, fine, the poison that is also coming out through this process. So there is always yin and yang. There is always that balance, right? That he will consume and hold so that, it doesn't then go on to harm all of the peoples or all of the, individuals in that era, let us say, if it is mythological or whatever the case may be. My understanding is that Shiva, for example, consumed cannabis as a way to mitigate the effect of the poison that he held, for example, in his throat, right? And I'm sure that there are various other sort of use cases. In a modern sense, I think we're also all familiar with at least the typical image of a Naga sadhu, a Baba, who is sitting at a mutt or a confluence of rivers at the Sangam, for example, or at a Kumbh Mela, in various different spiritual religious centers across the country. And we are familiar that they consume cannabis, usually smoke it through a chillam, for example, right? Now, one of the things that is known is that the reason, at least, that the Baba suggests or the Sadhu suggests that they consume cannabis is for them to go inward. So it is actually as a meditative practice, that through that intoxication, they channel their thought inwards for them to then practice whatever kriya, whatever asana, whatever yoga they may be doing. But I don't have any personal reference or understanding of it beyond that. So yes, very much part of our culture, which is very interesting. When we started Savikalpa Sciences, we thought that the first adopters of medicine would be the younger lot. It would be the 20, 30, 40-year-olds who are familiar with what is happening with medical cannabis globally.
Right.
And so they would be like, okay, great, maybe there's an opportunity for them to see what the potential therapeutic uses in India are. We were completely wrong. It is, in fact, the elderly. I would say that 70% of our patients at Savikalp are of 60 years of age or older. And what we find is that there is very significant awareness of the medical applications of cannabis and very significant acceptance of cannabis as medicine in the older lot.
Wow.
There are two reasons, I believe. One, older persons who've lived for, let's say, 60 years or more, if they're suffering from especially a chronic ailment, they are largely fed up with whatever expert medical intervention they have sought.
Right,
and I'm telling you, we have patients who are patients of means, who might be billionaires, but who can access all the medical therapeutics, available, probably go and buy out hospitals in, Boston if so required for them to get some relief, right? But, we're finding that even such persons who have exhausted all potential available therapies globally are finding some therapeutic benefit or significant therapeutic benefit through cannabinoid medicine. But that is to say that one, the elderly are probably fed up and they're like, look, just give me something that helps me be in, less discomfort. Give me something that gives me, I use the Hindi, Urdu word, rahat. Anything that gives me relief. Just give, I don't care whether it's a cannabis compound or whether it's a apple compound or whether it's a synthetic compound. Literally, it doesn't matter. As long as it works, I'm willing to try, right? That's one reason. But the second cultural reason is that the elderly oftentimes report to us saying that, oh, that's nothing new. My chachaji used to consume a cannabis ki goli because he used to have indigestion. Or my dadaji was, applying some kind of a lip which was for some kind of an injury. Or, so you're like, wait, there is awareness at the level of the elderly today. And elderly, I'm just saying, let's say, older person, 60 years of age. I don't want to be ageist here, but the elderly seem to have this automatic cultural understanding because cannabis was consumed within their household by the generation before them or the generations before them. This schism is a modern schism. It is only after the 1980s, once cannabis was banned. It is important to know cannabis was not banned prior to 1985 in India, right? It's a naturally occurring compound. It's like I'm saying I'm banning neem or I'm banning mango or I'm banning coconut. Okay, man, okay, ban coconut. It'll still grow.
Right.
It just grows automatically. So, these are modern issues, modern constructs. And I think that schism, this lack of awareness is really also something that probably only started post the mid-80s. But glad to say that we're coming back and reverting to mean. And hopefully by our efforts and efforts of others, who are trying to understand and push the understanding of application, not just of medicine, but maybe like you said, other spaces as well. We come back to a general acceptance and understanding of cannabis.
I'm glad you brought Savikalpa back into a conversation. I would like to understand from you what your bigger vision is. What are you trying to do?
Look, we really feel that there is very significant potential in cannabinoid compounds and going beyond cannabinoid and other naturally occurring compounds from a therapeutic lens. We feel that we as in India has the clinical research skills. We have doctors, we have scientists, we have clinicians, and we have a very large patient population. We have a very large health burden. Our belief is that if we push the frontiers really from an R&D first lens, then we should be able to come up with formulations that are both safe and effective in treating all manner, especially of chronic ailments. And the larger belief is that cannabinoids and naturally occurring medicines, which have gone through the rigors of modern drug standards. So this is not hocus pocus. This is not alternative medicine. One of our mandates is that, look, globally, especially in the West, and I had the privilege of growing up, outside the country. I've been in India for the past 15 years, but when I was a kid, I grew up overseas. One of the things that, we often find is that traditional systems of medicines are discredited. Oh, you've not done this test. Oh, you've not done that test. Oh, you've not done clinical development. Where is your phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4, post-marketing studies? Where are your safety studies? There are standards of medicine today, which are modern standards, right? Traditional medicine systems have not needed to, and they've been around for thousands of years. These are modern drug standards. So one of the ruses used by the global pharmaceutical industry is to say that, hey, you've not done A, B, C, D, E in terms of scientific validation of your medicines, of your interventions. What we believe is, okay, fine, let us take inspiration from those classical texts, but let us deploy the modern standards and let us do what is required. It is not, frankly, even rocket. I mean, today we've gone beyond rocket science, but it isn't even rocket science. You know that you have to do, preclinical pharmacology. You know that you have to do clinical pharmacology. Do that step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, step 5. If a Pfizer or a Novartis or a Johnson & Johnson can do it, why can't we?
True.
We have those resources. So for us, the mandate is, or the vision is, that can we make safe and effective medicines, especially those that are targeting chronic ailments for which there are not very successful existing medicines. And when I say successful, not successful existing medicines, there could be medicines that work, but that also create lots of harms. So you are treating something, but then you are leading to some kind of a dysregulation or some kind of another side effect that comes from consuming that medicine. We believe that we have the knowledge at the level of the human mind and at the level of human endeavor to make medicines that are safe to consume over a period of time and that are as, if not more effective than existing treatments. Furthermore, these medicines have a geo-economic lens also in our view. In my personal view, currently the Indian pharmaceutical industry is an amazing example of global standards of manufacturing excellence. We are rightly called the pharmacy of the world because we make generic medicines. Maybe we're not creating new drugs.
True.
It is actually quite unfortunate that since 1947 till date, no Indian company has created what is called a new chemical entity. No new paracetamol has been discovered in India. No new ibuprofen or cetirizine or whatever it is, right? Once things go off patent, we are able to replicate those medicines,
Cheaper.
make them at a fraction of the cost, at 100th of the cost. And this is a genuine social effort. It also creates immense wealth. We have, huge pharmaceutical industries, and we have some of the wealthiest individuals in the world who, come from the life sciences space. So enabling access to cheap and effective generic medicines by people in 150 countries around the world and for the wide majority of the human population is something that India should continue. And I'm saying India at the level of government should continue to elocute, even when we're talking at all the international fora like G20. I think this is the first thing that we should point to as success, because the standards are global.
Right.
And we make these medicines as per global standards.
And we have the capacity.
We have the capacity to.
Right.
The fact is that, like we procure, for example, the starter materials, APIs and KSMs are the basic compounds that are used then to make medicines, then to make formulations, then to make drugs, right? We import like 90% of these basic compounds needed. Unfortunately, most of that import reliance is on China. Now, if there was some geostrategic, disturbance, if there was any reason for China maybe to come out and say that we are restricting the supply of APIs and KSMs, which they could do. Let us say that we have a standoff on, the Straits of Malacca or whatever it is, and, China objects to our increasing naval presence in the South Andaman, for example, right? They could do some restriction, some trade restriction on, for example, supply of KSMs and APIs to the Indian pharmaceutical industry. A week's sort of disruption of that supply chain would negatively impact, not and very significantly negatively. I mean, let's say if the supply was stopped entirely, the Indian pharmaceutical industry would come to a halt.
Right.
We are entirely reliant on import of the basic compounds to make these medicines, which we then sell to the rest of the world, right? And it would not just be India that's a loser. It would be the whole world. And, especially the developing or, lower income countries of the world who are not able to access the medicines made by Novartis, Pfizer, Bayer or whatever the case may be, right? It would be the world that it becomes a net loser. So from that lens, we feel that if we can contribute to substitution of this import reliance, by making medicines from naturally and locally available compounds, then you are also contributing to improving your sort of geostrategic, geo-economic position, and especially from a health lens, right? Especially from a medical lens. So these are the two objectives. Can we make medicines that treat people and that provide relief to people who are currently suffering for various reasons? We believe the knowledge exists. It is just a question of us continuing to put in efforts to do scientific validation of the drug development and enable access to a wide population. And currently, these medicines, I would also like to add, are very expensive. There's no reason for them to be this expensive if we have to enable access to tens, if not hundreds of millions of people, right?
Correct.
But going beyond that, I also think that there is a very, very significant strategic element to focusing on creating natural product medicines from locally available bioresources so that we reduce our dependence on import of these pharmaceutical starter ingredients currently, which can disable our pharmaceutical industry and access to medicines globally. So these are the two, if you would ask me, two broader long-term vision slash missions.
That's nice. That's a long vision for you. I want to underline here that I introduced you as a company that's trying to change how we see medicine. We also know how bad the pharma industry is at the moment. Do you want to maybe underline what the situation is like?
First and foremost, look, I'm not a scientist, I'm not a doctor, I don't come from a technical background, right? So when I first started evaluating the potential of phytocannabinoids and phytomedicine, phyto being plant medicine generally, right? And which is very different to traditional plant medicine, modern natural compound medicine might be a better way to put it. I was lucky enough to go and meet this gentleman who retired as director of the National Cancer Institute in Jhajjar. He was also head of Department of Cancer of Oncology at the All India Institute of Medical Sciences, Professor Rath. Professor Gaura Rath was the first person that I spoke to, and I asked him, what do you think is the potential of cannabis? And he came back to say something which stayed with me till date. He said that he is the head of the Department of Oncology at the All India Institute, which is a premier medical institution in the country. He has a roster of, I don't know, scores of doctors that work there. He has access to public funds. He doesn't need to turn a profit like an Apollo or a Fortis or a Max does effectively, right? They don't need to justify the bottom line. He showed me some machine that he had, which, he said there are 4 of these in the world currently, this, that, and the other. But he gave me a telling fact. He said daily there are 1,400 cancer patients that come to All India Institute from around and across the country. Almost all of these are late stage terminally ill cancer patients because we have very poor early detection in the country, and primary care centers or even secondary care centers across the country are not geared up to treat oncology as well as they should be. And therefore, the only recourse, even for a poor person coming from a village in Odisha, they're like, okay, let's go to All India Institute or pata nahi kahan jana hai, right? So he said that despite having all the resources, they are able to treat 500, 600, 700 patients a day. And he's like, every day when I go back, he's like, I feel a sense of shame that despite being the top doctor, despite having all the resources, not having to bother about resources, they still can treat only about half the people who come to them on a daily basis. And he said that, Raghav, there is very significant potential that he believes exists in cannabis and cannabis compounds. And he's like, really, you must focus on this, because for these half that we are not able to treat, can we at least give them something that ensures that their terminal life is a little more comfortable, that they pass away in peace and nothing beyond that. In fact, Professor Rath even believes, and we are now seeing this in research, that there is curative applications like I mentioned earlier. But even from a pure palliative, from a pain relief, from a quality of life improvement, especially of terminally ill patients, that is something that stayed with me. Coming to your question, therefore, this is just the background to medical industry, to the pharmaceutical industry. If we are working on researching the therapeutic application of a cannabis compound, let us say, in treating prostate cancer, I'm just using one example, right? Or some other cancer, right? It could be liver cancer, it could be pancreatic, stomach, all kinds, right? There are very many different types of cancers, and there are different applications. And what we find is that what works for one doesn't work for the other. So there really is a lot of detailed sort of understanding that we need to build out. When speaking to one person from the pharmaceutical industry, it was almost shocking, right? Like I'm using this as an illustrative example of what I believe are the deficiencies of the global pharmaceutical industry. That the response was that, why are you wasting your time and money on researching a medicine to treat this terminal condition? This patient is going to die. What is your 10-year projection? You don't have a 10-year projection because you don't know whether this person is alive for 3 months, 6 months, or 3 years, let alone 10 years. What is the discounted cash flow and what is the present value of this patient? And I was like, we're talking about a human being. We're talking about a being who is suffering from an ailment that we don't even have medicine for. And you're saying, what is the cash flow of this patient and why are you wasting money? You're trying to heal. You're trying to find a cure. And if not find a cure, at least find something that eases their discomfort. If I were to tell you what the present value or discounted cash flow is, I might as well be making some chappals. I'll tell you what my projection is and whether I will sell 100 cases or whether I will sell 100 million cases, right? And I could tell you over 10 years, this is what I presume to be the case. Please give me $100 million and this is what the PV of the business is. And I'll come up with a valuation exercise. You're asking me to come up with a valuation of a patient. That's absolutely ridiculous. We're talking about health. We're talking about healing. If we have the knowledge to create something that can heal a person, then this should not be part of the equation. And in a nutshell, to me, that encapsulates the modern pharmaceutical industry.
It is the capitalist mindset that
We have knowledge, Shivam. We know what can cure. We don't want to cure. We want to cure. We want to treat, not cure. We want to treat just enough so that a person finds some improvement, but not for the person to get fully healed. Because if the person gets fully healed, they will not be purchasing your medicine again and again and again, forever and ever and ever. So maybe what we're doing at Savikalpa doesn't make too much commercial sense. Maybe I don't even know what the business case and a longitudinal sense is and how you generate profits versus sustain. Because look, if you can heal a person and if they don't need to access your medicine, well, great. You've actually healed a person. You've been at least assisted in healing a person, right? I do think it's the primary caregivers, it's the doctors, it is the healthcare professionals, and it is the caregivers, it is the family members, it is the community that actually heals. For us, we are part of that ecosystem and trying to provide something that might be more effective than some other tools or some other medicines that healers have access to. And I'm saying healers could be literally somebody in the family as well, right? Commercials apart, I think that there is a lot of potential, but unfortunately, in my view, I think that the most commercially minded industry that I have ever interacted with, and in another avatar, I ran and still to some extent run a public policy firm. We run an advocacy firm. I'm a lobbyist. I've had the privilege of working with, industries across the board. I think that one of the most commercially minded, and in fact, the most commercially minded and only commercially minded industry that I've come across is the life sciences and the pharmaceutical industry. And you sometimes question that should health be something which should have a bottom line to it? If you have knowledge, you should share that knowledge. It shouldn't just be whether it makes you money or not. But unfortunately, to answer your question, it's just money, in my view, that drives it drives all industries. Sure, it is the global utilitarian, kind of ecosystem that we live in. It is the capitalist ecosystem. But the worst sort of example of that, in my view, is perhaps the pharmaceutical industry.
It's saddening to hear that such instances about how capitalist our industries have become, but it's also inspiring to see people like you who are trying to tackle that and find better solutions.
We can just put in the effort, right? What the results are, I don't know, but you can keep the effort alive.
A point that you mentioned about the pharma industry was that for the last 100 years, it has been one industry which has not gone down. There are a lot of industries that go up and down. But
sure.
So I was just pointing that out for you.
So look, the scale of the challenge is very large, right? I mean, oftentimes, people even within my organization, Savikalpa, like, okay, we're in the cannabis medicine industry. I'm like, no, we're in the medicine, we're in the health and healing industry, first and foremost. We're in the pharmaceutical industry, but we're trying to change some aspects of the pharmaceutical industry. We're trying to deploy a different lens to the pharmaceutical industry. But if we are successful to some extent in our effort, in our mandate of bringing safe and effective and accessible formulations to people, the pushback will come from the global pharmaceutical industry. And it bears witness that even today, the 10 largest pharmaceutical companies in the world have a combined market cap as of February 2024 of $4.2 trillion. The India market cap of all listed companies in India is $4 trillion. So just the 10 largest pharma companies are larger than the entire, publicly listed ecosystem, enterprise ecosystem.
That's for a reason as well.
Country. It's for a reason.
For a reason,
right? So they are so sharply focused on their cash flow and their bottom line and therefore they are so sharply valued. People don't know that a Johnson and Johnson is twice the size of Reliance. People have never heard, maybe largely, of Novo Nordisk. Novo Nordisk is 3 times the size of Reliance. We think that in India, Reliance Industries is the bellwether and basically the leitmotif of the Indian stock market and the Indian economy. There are scores of pharma companies. We don't even think of J&J as a pharma company.
Yeah.
We think that it makes baby oil and baby powder and this, that, and the other. It's a pure play drug company.
Raghav, before we quickly wrap up on this conversation, can you tell the viewers how bad it is for us to pop random, medicine and drugs that we take for our headaches, for our whatever ailments that we have, and what should be the substitute?
What may be the substitute really depends on what we're popping effectively.
Right.
But
Right.
at least when it comes to medicine, I think that India has got this pill popping culture, which is probably second only to the United States in my view, and I've been privileged to live in the US as well as in India. I think that we really should follow guidance. We should seek the advice of a medical professional, a doctor. In India, almost everybody is, paramedic. I feel that, you know what it is and you just go and buy whatever medicines at the pharmacy. Vigilance is quite limited. Compliance to rules is quite limited. So, many medicines that we buy, which we think are over-the-counter medicines, are actually restricted and supposed to be sold only on a prescription. Even a paracetamol is a prescription medicine. But it's sold OTC or whatever it is. I think paracetamol is. I would need to check that. So please do fact check and correct me and put a disclaimer. But I do believe that even paracetamol is a prescription medicine. But in India, we go ahead and pop medicines willy-nilly, left, right, and center. The most significant thing to know is that allopathic medicines are very useful. Again, I don't want to badmouth allopathic medicines. You absolutely require them for acute medical management. There are ways of living, there are ways of eating, there are ways of breathing and thinking, and also consuming naturally occurring compounds, whether as food or as medicine, that can prevent disease, that can lead to your being so healthy that you don't need medical intervention in the first place. But in many cases and many times you do require, and therefore there is a very good use case. But only and only for that use case. What happens today is that you just go ahead and without really any threshold, you go ahead and pop whatever pill because you want an immediate result. I think it has to do with our immediate satisfaction, gratification that we seek in all elements of life, I suppose, and that reflects also in how we consume medicines. But please note that wantonly consuming various what we might consider even simple medicines like beta blocker or like citrazine, I'm going to say, or an Allegra or whatever, right? If you have a very significant allergy, which is, kind of exacerbated by an increase in pollen, which we might see these days as we're at the turn of summer effectively, right? Fine, you please consume an antihistamine, but an antihistamine, if you're consuming for more than 5 days, forget that. If you're consuming a Crocin or a paracetamol for more than 5 days, go and do a liver function test. Right. There is a Dr. Dangs here, or there is a, Dr. Pathlab, this, that, and the other. Just do a LFT test, a liver function test, right? Do a CFT, LFT test. See what your levels in terms of your, diagnostics are, right? They would be more elevated, or do like, a kidney function test, for example, right? They would be more elevated than that of a chronic alcoholic, right? And so those things we don't realize that longitudinally and long term, for symptomatic management of something that is troubling us, we might end up creating troubles for us in the long run, which can be very challenging.
So for basic problems, what Raghav is saying is just consult the doctor and maybe have a tall glass of water and do some breathing exercises. That would do the thing.
Absolutely. Or maybe some other, desi nuskhe perhaps. Desi nuskhe work.
There's so many.
And that's why they've been around and that's why they were there, earlier, and they continue to be prevalent today. I think it's time for us to rediscover some of the simpler ways of managing, especially physical discomfort. They exist and they work. Let's bring them back into
Raghav, this has been a very insightful conversation for me. But before I go, I asked my guests 2 very important questions, personal questions that I asked them. Since this podcast is called Diary of a Publisher, I make sure to ask something about the book as well. And you read a lot, looking at your wisdom and the insights that you give me. What is one book that you wish, Raghav, you would have read earlier in your life? Could be any subject. Doesn't have to be policy. Doesn't have to be in terms of medicine. Could be spiritual. Something that changed your life, and you wish. I hope you would have read this earlier.
It's hard for me to say what I wish I would have read earlier. I feel that I used to read a lot more earlier than I do today. And I think that, coming from a family that always encouraged reading and I had access to good libraries and resources, I can't think of a book that I can really point to Shivam as saying that I wish I'd read.
For you, I'll rephrase the
Earlier.
question. What is your favorite book out there that has changed you as you are?
Favorite book out there? It is a book which probably comes up quite often. And I think it's a very simple explanation and explication of the systems of Indian philosophy, or what we call yoga, and that is Autobiography of a Yogi.
Wow.
I think that I would say that Autobiography of a Yogi is definitely a top 10 book, and I might even, if you're pushing me to probably come up with that, assuming that there's fiction and non-fiction, both, but really I would say that Autobiography of a Yogi is probably one book that had a very, very significant impact on me at an early age.
Beautiful. That's a beautiful book as well. My last and final question for today, which is another personal question, is what piece of advice would you give to your younger 18-year-old self, Raghav?
Focus and study physics or study law. This is my latter day understanding, but also learn from your peers. There is no greater learning than that which you will learn by being open and interactive and exploring other people's thoughts. I think that is the biggest learning. But when it comes to, let's say, a young person looking to develop their faculties, and obviously follow your passion, right? I mean, that goes without saying. So if you are very uncertain of what it is that you wish to study, and even if you hate science, or if you hate law, at least with with a few gray hair, I can say that I would recommend studying either physics or studying law as two subjects if you are undecided.
Why is that?
Uncertain. Because I feel that physics at one level helps you understand all phenomena. And, therefore, there is a fundamental development and application of mind, which you can then use to, become a better cook or a better teacher or a better, engineer. Doesn't matter, right? Effectively. And law, I feel, is something which forms the basis of governance of society. If you wish to live isolated in a forest, in a dharamshala, and meditate, maybe you don't need to study law. But effectively, I think that it gives you a very thorough understanding of the regulations or rules that govern the social compact that we call society.
Right.
So,
right.
These are two, I'm going to call them general disciplines.
Got it,
We might
got
think
it.
that their focus is specific. They're general disciplines, which I think hold you in good stead, irrespective of what you're doing in life.
Wow, beautiful. Thank you so much for your time and this conversation. I took a lot of insights, and I'm sure the audience did as well. Thank you so much,
Thank you so
Raghav.
much.
Appreciate
Pleasure
that.
once again. Thank you for having
so
me.
much, you as well. Thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed the episode, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Until then, keep reimagining yourself and know that the power of change lies within you.